One. Welcome everyone to the final plenary talk at our conference on natural theology in the 21st century. Our final talk of today, Friday, what is the date today? Friday the 16th of July, right. And very pleased to welcome back Helen de Cruz, Professor Helen de Cruz. I say welcome back because she was one of our colleagues here at Oxford for several years, and now she's a full professor in the United States. She holds the Danforth Chair in the Humanities at St. Louis University. So thank you very much for coming back to join us. Your husband spoke this morning at 5:30 in the morning, St. Louis time. You have, I think, a more civilized time to speak. So welcome. And your title of your talk is A Taste for the Infinite, What Evolution Can Tell Us About Belief in God. So please welcome Helen de Cruz with whatever gesture is appropriate for your technology.
I mute myself. Okay. Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you so much for making this conference happen. And thank you for a really, really cool topic and for the talk so far. And I'm going to share my screen. I want to just also start out by saying, because I have the opportunity to do so, in philosophy of religion and theology, a few days ago, online, there was a really terrible misogynistic incident. And I just wanted to say, like everybody present, to think about, try to make the profession a bit more welcoming for, women and other minorities, people of color, trans people, and so on. And I was just quite shocked about it. And I just thought, since I see so many theologians and philosophers of religion, it'd be useful to at least keep it in mind to, make the profession welcoming to everybody. So with that in mind, let's start with this talk. I've been working on this paper for a while. Pandemic happened, so it's still not in quite the sort of final shape that I'd like it to be. But it's a topic I've been thinking about for a while, namely about how we can use the philosophy of biology and in conversation with theology and philosophy of religion to think about belief in God. And so as you'll see throughout this presentation, the pictures in the presentation are all from Ernst Haeckel, who was an evolutionary biologist, but also an artist. And I think the pictures are really amazing. So just for that reason, because I think they really sort of highlight the idea of diversity and beauty in the living world, which we will look at in more detail. Whoops. Yes. So let's first, so my talk will look at philosophy of biology in conversation with Friedrich Schleiermacher's idea of God consciousness, to think about religion and about, how religion is part of human nature and what this might be. Now, to set the context properly, since the Enlightenment, there was the hope by some people that religion will eventually play a less prominent role in the public sphere, and that would correlate with a less prominent role of religion in the private sphere. And so why would this be? Why would religion go downhill and ultimately disappear altogether? Well, there were various answers to this. So in the 18th and early 19th century, you had several ideas on the table, such as functionalism, which was this idea that religion serves a purpose. So the reason that we have religions is to organize society in some sense. People like Émile Durkheim and Marcel Mauss wrote about that. And the idea is that, just like Wittgenstein's ladder, you could just kick religion away after a while if it was no longer fit for purpose, and that we could use secular institutions to do just the same thing. Next to that, you had evolutionism, and evolutionism was this idea first proposed by Auguste Comte, the positivist French philosopher, that our culture sort of goes into different stages. So first you have animism, then you have the monotheism with laws and so on. And then eventually you have the scientific stage. So monotheism is not the final stage, there's a stage after. And this scandalized people when they read Fraser's Golden Bough, that eventually would go on to the scientific stage. But interestingly, the Golden Bough, written by Fraser in 1890, had a huge influence. And lots of people thought in the United Kingdom and elsewhere that ultimately it was just a matter of time before people would realize the that science was the way to go, and they would ditch religious beliefs. However, we are now 2021, enthusiasm for religion remains high. Over 80% of people, according to all sorts of global surveys, self-declare a religious affiliation. And so a question that is asked since Kant is, why are people still religious in the light of modernity, science, rationality, however you want to put it? Why is that the case? Now, interestingly, one proposal that in the 18th century already was on the table was Schleiermacher's proposal in his discourses to what he called the cultural despisers of religion. And his idea is that religion is unavoidable. Religion is unavoidable because it is intrinsically human. And interestingly, this proposal, which I'm going to flesh out a bit more in detail, does find resonance in contemporary authors. So for example, you have Robert Macaulay's book, Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not, a book written in, I think, around 2011. And Macaulay says something very similar, like religion is sort of part of our being human. And that alone, while you can't just make a justification like, oh, religion is human nature, and therefore it is a justification of some kind. Like, you know, you're not going to have something like secularization if religion is this, this enduringly human thing. Now, Schleiermacher's proposal is a bit more specific in that he argued that religious feeling arises out of our condition of being a biological organism. And in the present paper, I will examine Schleiermacher's proposal in the light of contemporary philosophy of biology. And particularly, I will look at the notion of a biological organism as a subject, an object, and a knower. And I'll look at how we can conceive of agency, having a point of view, and having freedom, creaturely freedom, and the way that evolutionary biologists have thought about this. Now, you might think creaturely freedom is a really theological notion, but it is also a biological notion, and philosophers of biology have thought a great deal about it. And in particular, one of the people I'm in conversation with here is Richard Lewontin, who died just very recently, I think earlier this month. And he is such an interesting evolutionary thinker, and he has such a wide range of things that he engaged with. And I'm really pleased to be able to sort of commemorate one of the great contributions that he did to the philosophy of biology, which I will discuss a bit in a moment. And then I will relate these concepts from evolutionary biology to Schleiermacher's concept of God consciousness and the related concepts that come into that, namely his feeling of absolute dependence and what it means to have creaturely freedom. Now, then I will wonder, okay, why does Schleiermacher have this very biological notion of religious belief? And then I'll say it doesn't come out of nowhere, because he has a very naturalistic way of looking at the way religion and the way we evolved, even though there was no evolutionary theory when he wrote, when Christliche Glaube was published. It's nevertheless the case that we'll see that there are some proto-evolutionary theories on the table already at this point, like Lamarck and Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, and so on. And then I'll look at a naturalistic basis for God consciousness. Okay. So to situate Friedrich Schleiermacher, so he was, people would say German philosopher, but Germany didn't exist at the time. So we'll say Prussian philosopher and theologian who lived in the 18th, 19th century. And he worked against a backdrop. So again, so this was a kind of reformed evangelical Lutheran, sort of a mix of these different views. And he is commonly considered the first modern theologian for reasons that will also become clear. Now, we tend to think sometimes like, you know, one is the heydays of Christianity in the West. Maybe it was the 18th, 19th century, but it's kind of hard to sort of look back and to see that already in the 18th, 19th century, there was a serious identity crisis going on in Christianity in the West. And it had to do with things like critical biblical scholarship, with the fact that there have been religious wars, which has ravaged Europe for centuries, with the fact that science came as a very serious contender and seemed to have, win the day, like, even if they didn't at the time, like with the Galileo trial and stuff like that. So there was a serious identity crisis, and there was a serious question, and there were more and more people, like the French encyclopedist, who said Christianity is just not a credible intellectual option anymore. And it's in this context that you have to think about Schleiermacher, and particularly the following works. So first you have über die Religion reden an die Gebildeten unter ihren Verächtern. So this is the speeches on religion to its cultural despisers. And then you have the magisterial large 2-volume, at least published in 2 volumes, Christliche Glaube nach den Grundsätzen der evangelischen Kirche, which is a dogmatic theology that paragraph per paragraph looks at doctrines of the Christian faith and then tries to get these in conversation with, what's the philosophical ideas at the time, the Kantian sort of ideas that were at the time, the sciences of the time. So it's a kind of enlightenment project of trying to see these doctrines of Christian faith and to see if they still made sense. Now, in the 18th, 19th century, you had lots of people who, in reaction to biblical criticism, religious wars, colonialism, all the sorts of things that basically damaged Christianity's intellectual standing already at that time, you had various ways of saying, yes, we still need Christianity, religion. Often those two things were sort of put as synonymous. And the main apologetic strategies were either that religion is useful. So Kant, as you know, maybe, didn't think that natural theological arguments worked, but he thought that religion is useful. Religion makes us more moral. Religion makes things rational for us to do that otherwise wouldn't be rational. And then you had another strategy in the 18th century, still very popular. Alistair McGrath, in his overview of natural theology, points at the 17th century as like the big heydays of natural theology, but we still had a lot of 18th century natural theology where religion is natural, is rational through observation or a priori. But then you have Schleiermacher's strategy, and he's not alone in that strategy. So especially later on, you see the strategy more with people like Rudolf Otto and William James. Religion is natural. So religion is in a sense unavoidable because it is natural for creatures like us to have religion. Religion is, as he put it beautifully, I think, a sensibility and a taste for the infinite. So here you have sort of the main central quote in the speeches, the discourses to the cultural despisers. Religion's essence is neither thinking nor action, but intuition and feeling. It wishes to intuit the universe, wishing devoutly to overhear the universe's own manifestations and actions, longs to be grasped and filled by the universe's immediate influences in childlike passivity. So it's a beautiful quote, but one thing to keep in mind is that the word like feeling and intuition isn't quite the words that we use today, intuition and feeling. So with intuition, you have to think about Kant's use of intuition in Critique of Pure Reason, where intuition is more like there's certain sort of things that come onto your cognitive system, onto your perception and your cognition, and you react to it. Like, for example, you look outside at night, you see some stars, probably not as much as Schleiermacher did, but you still see quite some stars, and it gives you a certain, both emotionally and rationally and perceptually, it influences you. So you are basically passive and being impinged upon. That's intuition. And then you have feeling, and the original term for that is Gefühl, which Schleiermacher derived from Stephens, other early German philosopher and scientists. And that's basically the immediate presence of the whole undivided personal existence. So it's not like a purely subjective feeling, a bit like, oh, I'm feeling like a banana or something like that. It's more like the kind of feeling that arises out of your, as a kind of consciousness of you being in the world. So that's feeling or Gefühl. And Schleiermacher argued that religion is distinct from science because science aims to understand the world. How? By putting it in human terms. Religion doesn't do that. Religion doesn't want to put things in our terms. Religion takes things on their own terms, which are things that we can't always understand and grasp. Scientists want to understand and interpret. Religion is, in a sense, happy with just letting things be. And this is here, Schleiermacher parts with many 18th century philosophers that religion is also distinct from morality. Religion is not some sort of moral code. Morality is practical and gives us concrete guidelines on how to act, but religion doesn't do that in his view. Rather than a practice or a science, religion is sensibility and a taste for the infinite, as I said. So to be human is to be religious, because we have this gefühl, we have this feeling, this self-consciousness, which arises from our creaturely nature. And that is the religious impulse too. It's not only the religious impulse, I mean, it's our way of being in the world, but it's also giving us the religious impulse. So to hold Christian beliefs is both an individual response to this religious impulse that we all have, but it's also a communal response. And to explain why we have this particular set of Christian constellations, you have a variety of cultural and other factors that come into that. So Schleiermacher's view on religion as feeling and his later concept of God consciousness, I'm now, just to recap what we've done up till now. So I'm now just giving you like a really brief overview of Schleiermacher's idea of feeling, of religion as feeling. And now I'm going to bring that into conversation with philosophy of biology and combine these insights with his idea that religion originates from our creaturely nature. Now, I haven't talked about God consciousness, and I thought I'll just split Schleiermacher up. I'll talk a little bit about God consciousness later, and then I'll frame that in evolutionary biological terms. And my analysis will show that Schleiermacher's ideas anticipated insights on the relationship of creatures to their environment, which we have in contemporary philosophy of biology, such as Richard Lewontin, Peter Godfrey Smith, and Samir Okasha. So let's now go a little bit to the philosophy of biology, and we'll look at the standard picture of what creatures are, what organisms are. Now, since the modern synthesis, which you have to situate like somewhere in the 40s, 50s with people like Sewell Wright, John Maynard Smith, Williams, there is the idea that organisms have genes, and these genes are subject to random variation. Now, what explains why some variations persist and other variations disappear? Well, that's because of external forces. So you have this organism and external forces impinge upon the organism, the weather, geology, other organisms. And so as a result, the organism will either die or survive, have fewer or more offspring. And over time, the frequency of alleles of certain genetic variations in the population will change. And then the species will change as a result of that. And then you have all sorts of processes of speciation, evolution within species, and so on. And natural selection occurs. So that's a very basic picture. However, Lewontin argued as early as 1983, this is super early. So this is before you had all the stuff on evolutionary developmental biology, and before you had niche construction. He said, look, the problem with this picture is that it ignores the agency of the organism. It's almost like the organism is like this plaything which just is being pushed about by the forces of evolution. But you know, organisms interact with their environment. And you see here this very brave gazelle, where apparently the predator in question, the leopard, I think, took more than it could chew, apparently. And this happens a lot. So you can see, like, you can put any fun David Attenborough movie on, and you can see there that, organisms are not just passive things. They have a role in their own fate. They have a stake in their own fate. And that stake pushes them to exert some influence on the long-term evolutionary outcomes. So an organism is both an object on which things act in physical terms, but it is also a subject, it acts. And Lewontin argued that at the time, evolutionary biology did not pay sufficient attention to that. Now, it's interesting to note that we can see when did this happen? So how come organisms became subjects like that with a stake and with at least doing things towards, their own survival. And I sound teleological, but this is teleological. Like if you have any mobile organism, it will not want, and even immobile, not want to be eaten, not want to be destroyed, and so on. Now, if we go a little bit back in time, and you look at the Cambrian explosion around 550 million years ago, then you will see that it's dazzlingly diverse. And here's, so if you get the chance to go to the Natural History Museum in Oxford or any other, then you can see, like, if you see all the spectacular fossils, those fossils are very likely going to be from the Cambrian period. And what do we see? Well, we see things like weapons, protective exoskeletons, we see legs, we see senses. And here is a sort of picture that gives a kind of image of what life in the Cambrian underwater would have looked like. You have trilobites, and here are just many, many trilobites. They had an exoskeleton. They could curl into a ball to defend the soft underbelly. They had long spikes because they for defense, so that they wouldn't be eaten. And now we think of this as like the normal state of affairs. Like, this is what you see. If you have organisms, they will have legs to run away. They'll have weapons to defend themselves. They will have exoskeletons or other skeletons to make themselves a bit more firm. However, what explains the Cambrian explosion? In fact, for the longest time, geologists thought that this was actually when life about started. But we know now that life is much older, like it's older than 1 billion years, significantly older. But anything before the Cambrian explosion looks a little bit less spectacular. So I put a picture here of a typical Ediacaran life form. If you look at life before, nothing much is happening. So they were soft-bodied. You have, again, a sort of picture of what life would look like. So imagine these soft-bodied, mostly immobile creatures. So you had to split between animals and so the big kingdoms in microscopic organisms. But animals were mostly immobile, and they absorbed nutrients through their skin, and they were quite flat. Why were they flat? Well, because there wasn't that much oxygen, and there wasn't enough oxygen to be pumped around the body. If the oxygen can't be pumped around the body, you need to be flat so that the oxygen can diffuse inside the body. However, at the end of the Ediacaran, there was a modest increase in oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere due to all sorts of complex processes. And the latest research indicates it wasn't like a huge injection of oxygen, but there was still enough oxygen to all of a sudden make it possible to put oxygen into the body and to circulate that. So some animals had this as a strategy. They pumped oxygen throughout the body, and that allowed for more complex body shapes, and it made mobility possible. So here you have one example, and this creature, I have no idea how to pronounce it, something like Anomalocaris, which is a Cambrian predator, about 40 centimeters, so quite substantial, and it had flaps at the side of its body. It had appendages to scan the surface and to eat. So it has these fantastic looking jaws here in the front. It isn't quite, so in the bottom picture, you can see the jaws, and people had this image about this super predator in the Cambrian. It isn't quite like that. It was mostly still probably sort of scavenging. But nevertheless, it scanned, it had jaws, it has eyes. Now, it's not a great idea at this point to just be sitting around waiting for somebody to eat you. So this gave rise to a runaway effect of predator-prey interactions. It was an evolutionary disadvantage of sitting around, so mobility and agency became important. It became important for organisms to be able to move around, and to do things this way, or to become so big or robust enough, as in plants, that you could propagate with, in spite of not being able to move. But so at least for animals, it became important for many clades within animals to move around. So agency in organisms, and this is a point that Peter Guthrie Smith makes in that wonderful book about octopuses, agency in organisms results from the fact that organisms are in this lockstep with predators and with other creatures. So you get legs, you get fins, you get other appendages to be able to flee from predators or to go towards prey. And you also need senses, of course, because otherwise, where are you going? So senses, eyes, feelers, and other senses to detect where you are going. And spectacularly, so McGee has this study where he sort of looks at each individual thing like legs, eyes, ears, mouths, and he shows how many times independently these things evolved. So the eye, for example, evolved at least 49 times independently. In our lineage, the core data, this was around 500 million years ago. And why? Well, because we have this central light source, the sun, and it's super convenient to be able to use this to avoid predators, to find food, and so on. But then, of course, once you have fairly complex senses and you need to integrate the different senses and you need to know what to do with the information from the senses, you get the brain, you get something like neurons. So in, for example, a jellyfish, there isn't like a central system and it's sort of diffused throughout the body, but in many clades, like for example, in arthropods, so insects and shrimps and so on, and then also in mammals and fish and so on, it's just all part in one brain. So it seems like we are far removed from Schleiermacher, but as we will see, there is a link between all of this and being a subject, an agent, and a knower. Now, Lewontin's insight was that all organisms, as I said, are agents, that they do stuff, they are subjects. Now, you might wonder, what makes a biological organism an agent? I could say, yeah, my cat is certainly an agent, but a fly is maybe an agent, but what about a cactus? Is that an agent? So there's this cool book by Samir Akasha on agency and evolution, where he outlines the following rather liberal criteria on what constitutes agency in organisms. So he says that an organism has to be goal-directed, has to be doing things for a purpose. And so in that respect, the spikes on a cactus constitute a kind of agency, even though the cactus didn't consciously grow them, because they do have a purpose. The purpose is not to be eaten. Then there is behavioral flexibility, which is being able to adapt one's behavior in the face of circumstances. So for example, you see here this bumblebee, and bumblebees in various experiments, you can sort of give them artificial flowers, and then the different colors of flowers have different yields of nectar, and they will choose the flowers with the highest yield of nectar. And there's obviously very spectacular bee dances in social bees. So there is this behavioral flexibility. And then there is adaptations that allow organisms to further their interests. So for example, this owl, the snowy owl, makes an auditory map of the environment, so that just the sounds, they can sort of have a map in their heads that links the sounds, and that they don't, even under very bad lighting conditions, they are able to find their way around. Now, Guthrie Smith agrees in large outline with the idea of agency that we saw in Lewontin and that we saw in Akasha, but he adds a further thing, namely that to treat an organism also as a subject. So he says that organisms next to agents are also subjects. And subjects have a point of view on the world. So these are his two criteria. Organisms that are subjects have a point of view on the world, and they have an agenda. Now, point of view on the world is like something like, what's it like to be a bat? There is a certain phenomenology of being a bat. Now, you might think this is a big problem because we will never know what it's like to be a bat. See the famous paper by Nagel, but you don't need to know what it's like to be a bat. The only thing we need to know is that there is a point of view of the bat, and that it's going to be all different species of bats, different points of view, and even individual bats have their own point of view. You don't need to know the point of view, but you need to know that there is a point of view, and we have enough to say that. And next to that, the organism has an agenda. An organism isn't a purely passive thing. It has certain interests, like even a plant. The plant's interest, for example, of a little oak tree is to become a bigger oak tree. And this sounds very Aristotelian, but this is not a big deal in contemporary philosophy of biology. So you can say they have this interest. So they have this interest. And in that respect, you could say that most organisms actually are subjects. And actually, according to Guthrie Smith, all cellular life is subject to some extent, because even single cell organisms like an amoeba are responsive to their environment. So next to the organism as an agent and a subject, we need to also add the organism as a knower, because the mind acts as a bridge between what the agent receives as stimulus and its actions. Now, I know there's a lot of recent work about plants and this really cool recent book about trees, that we can put trees as knowers. So I don't know, I think you need some sort of nervous system in order to count as a knower. But you can say like lots and lots of different animals are knowers, like even jellyfish and other really sort of cognitively primitive organisms are knowers to some extent, because they integrate information and they then act on the basis of that information. So to sum up, we've seen that contemporary philosophers of biology see that biological organisms are things that do things, that are agents, that feel things, so they have a point of view, they are subjects. And this is very close to Schleiermacher's idea of Gefühl, namely, you have a certain sort of feeling that arises from your point of view in the world. And they represent things, they are knowers. And it's interesting, but in the beginning, in the very first paragraphs of the Christian faith, Schleiermacher also looks at these three same things. As we as creatures, we are agents, we are subjects, and we are knowers. And of these three forms, he proposes that feeling, the being a subject, the having a point of view, that is in his view the basis of religion. Now, identifying religion with feeling does not mean that religion would be unconnected with doing and knowing. It is clearly connected to those things. Like if you're religious, you will do things that are related to being religious. But ultimately, he thinks that the origin, the sort of pulse, the impulse that makes us religious is ultimately feeling. And so feeling is the receptivity of creatures to their environment, as we have seen also spelled out by contemporary philosophers of biology. So for example, so we see this here in the third paragraph. So very early in the Christian faith, he writes, the piety, and so the Schleiermacher term for religion is piety, and there's a whole discussion about whether you can translate it, but anyway, piety. The piety that constitutes the basis of all ecclesiastical communities, regarded purely in and of itself, is neither a knowing nor a doing, but a distinct formation of feeling or of immediate self-consciousness. So Schleiermacher, like contemporary philosophers of biology, situates knowing, doing, and feeling as constitutive of our lives. And life is an interchange between what he calls a subject's remaining within oneself and a stepping out of oneself. So both we have certain things within ourselves, but we also relate to the outside world. Knowing and feeling relate to the first of remaining within oneself, and the outward thing that relates to doing. And then he goes into quite some detail about why he thinks that doing and knowing are not the essence of piety, but that it must be feeling. So knowing, he thinks, is not so important, because then he says the most learned theologians would be the most religious, and that's clearly not the case. And I think it's so lovely that he doesn't even think you need to motivate that. And doing, again, like the people who would be doing the most stuff would be the most religious, but clearly that's not the case either. So he says it must be feeling. So feeling allows us, Gefühl, allows us to become aware of two things, namely that we are dependent. And now I'm coming to this notion of God consciousness, which is a very sticky, tricky topic. We are dependent on other creatures in the environment. And ultimately, that feeling of dependence leads us to feel a kind of experiential dependence on God. And he calls that latter feeling God consciousness. And he equates it with a feeling of absolute dependence. So just to recall, feeling is not a purely subjective thing in Schleiermacher's mind. It is something that arises out of our condition of being, out of us being a physical, biological thing. So how does God consciousness arise? There is a tension, he says, between two things. One is you're an object, you're being acted upon. But second, you're a subject, you are capable of acting. Now, there's a lot of discussion about what freedom might be, and Schleiermacher's definition of freedom is very minimalistic. So freedom happens when you can produce an effect, and you are free if you produce those effects without being coerced. So that's all that is needed. So you don't need a whole explanation about how did you come to do this. If you are not being coerced at this point, then you are free. And when you act, you produce an effect and you have freedom. However, when you act, the world pushes back against you. Like you can't, like, it's very clear, there's clear, simple examples. Like you could say, oh, I would love to fly, and it's not going to happen. So there's these limitations of the world, you know, gravity and the like, preventing you from doing certain things. Or you might want to decide and do something, and other people just don't agree with your decision. Like, I'd love to move house. No, I'd rather not move house, say other people in your family, and then you just don't. So the world pushes back against you. So absolute dependence then is a feeling of oneness that arises out of a tension of a feeling of dependence and a feeling of freedom. So what happens is you have this feeling, this push and pull of you being an agent, of being able to do things, and then also the world impinging upon you. So you have relative freedom. You always have relative freedom. You don't have absolute freedom. You never have those people who think that they are absolutely free. So he briefly discusses, you have those people who think they're absolutely free. I suppose the nobles in the 18th century, the billionaires now, they think you can do anything, but actually that's not true. That you're just as constrained. Like you could say, I'd love to go to space. I'd love to do that, but you're still constrained. Like, you know, the rocket has to be built. You still need oxygen and that sort of thing. And so you are dependent on the rest of the world for anything you do. Anything that you do will require that. So you have this feeling of dependence, to be sure, as he writes, in as much as the other parts bear an effect on oneself out of their own self-initiated activity. So the fact that other things in the environment have their own self-initiated activity is going to create this feeling of dependence. You can't just like do anything by yourself. It's always going to depend on other people doing things. And you also have this feeling of freedom in as much as one bears an effect on other parts of one's own self-initiated activity. Now, this is not unique to humans, but it just arises out of our creaturely nature. And you are never, ever absolutely free, but you are absolutely dependent. This is an objective state of affairs. And the feeling that arises as a result of that is the feeling of absolute dependence. Now, the absolute dependence is not a feeling of being one with the world, because you could just say, look, I'm part of this big system that is the world. The fact that I, for instance, want to buy, I don't know, vegetables requires that the vegetables are grown somewhere, requires that the vegetables are transported to me. However, Schleiermacher rejects that idea because he says the world isn't really a unity as such. Even if it presents itself as a unity, it's a unity divided and split apart within itself. So you need something else to on which everything is dependent on, and that is the only free thing, and the only free thing is God. So with our environment, we feel the push and pull of acting and being acted upon, but God cannot be changed. So the feeling of the world around us is relative dependence, but the feeling of God is absolute dependence. Now, I want to put it clear, like this is a natural theology conference, but this is not an experiential proof for the existence of God. The first paragraphs in the Christian faith are not, I have a feeling of absolute dependence, therefore God exists. It's definitely not that. Rather, Schleiermacher argues that religion is rooted in a feeling. The feeling has an origin in our creaturely nature, and he then examines what follows from that for the Christian faith. So the rest of the Christian faith, all this dogmatic theology, has to be seen in the light of the fact that ultimately we have this religious feeling because of this absolute dependence relationship, but it gives certain feelings. And that is how you should look at the whole of the dogmatic theology. So to recap, organisms are both objects and subjects with goals, with a point of view, and with behavioral flexibility. Now, here's just a bit of speculation, like how did Schleiermacher do this, think about these things about us being creatures? Would he have known anything about the biology of the time? So before the 1859, as many people know, and it's increasingly known, evolutionary theory, as co-written by Wallace and Darwin, didn't just fall out of the sky. There was a long history of so-called transmutationist theories. And in fact, a very influential one is by Benoit de Maillet, Téliamed, from 1748, which he probably knew, it was very popular, which said the sea as the origin of life. And this was actually to account for shark teeth that people found everywhere. And Steno, the Catholic bishop and geologist, in fact, found these, so people showed him a big shark and he said, yeah, look, these stones are actually shark teeth. So the idea was the sea was once very widespread and all life comes from the sea. And then you had Lamarck with his philosophie zoologique, also very popular. So it's very likely Schleiermacher knew about it. And Daniel Peterson has argued that Schleiermacher accepted transmutationist theory. And he does it on the basis of the following paragraph in the Christian faith. We know fairly certainly of our earth that there have been species on it which are no longer extant, and that the present species have not always existed. So this sounds fairly uncontroversial, but this was in fact hugely controversial. And this is the only theory at the time. And there were several naturalistic ideas about the origin of life. You had the Bildungstrieb and evolutionism, which is not the same as evolutionary theory, but actually transmutation, pre-evolutionary theory, was the only one that said that there are species that have not existed and have come on the earth now and that are no longer existing. So the idea of extinction and evolution of new species. And Peterson argues that Schleiermacher could have drawn on the poetry of Erasmus Darwin, but I think, given what was all, and given that he was so widely read, it could have been anything. Now, Schleiermacher not only attempted to explain religion as a feeling, but also as a kind of, he sketches this really cool evolution of human self-consciousness. So he sees self-consciousness arise in human evolution. Now, at the time, 1830, evolution from apes was not definitely established. There were certainly some speculations given our morphological similarity. The first definite firm formulation comes from Huxley with man's place in nature. However, if you look at the following paragraph from the Christian faith, suppose we go back to the initial more obscure period of the life of human beings. Everywhere therein, we would then find the animalistic life to be almost alone predominant, but the spiritual life would still be entirely suppressed. As a result, moreover, we would have to imagine the state of a human being's consciousness in that obscure period to be very much akin to that of the lower animals. So within the Christian faith, you have this kind of evolutionist idea that humans have actually the highest degree of self-consciousness. So it's very clear about that. Humans have the highest degree of self-consciousness and other creatures have lesser degrees of self-consciousness that arises out of their creature nature, but they don't have quite the cognitive capacities to deal with this adequately and to formulate it adequately. And this is interesting because in that Schleiermacher also sort of so there's later ideas by Desjardins and by Barfield and by Conway Morris that sort of have similar ideas about how consciousness and self-awareness ascend. So you definitely see that in Schleiermacher, and that is also an evolutionary or proto-evolutionary idea. So how do we as humans feel that absolute dependence on God? And the feeling of absolute dependence in Schleiermacher's view arises from the sense both that we are acted upon and that we act in the world, that God cannot be acted upon. And so you have this sense of absolute dependence. And that feeling we share with other creatures with subjectivity. But so just to very briefly talk a little bit about what concretely, what sorts of experiences we might have that give us this sense of God consciousness. And the cognitive science of religion can give us some notion of what it might consist of. So it's also important to note that Schleiermacher is not committed to like that. He says religion is feeling, Gefühl, but it's not the case that it's not necessarily the case that for him religion is like a single special religious specific feeling. Later in authors like Rudolf Otto, I have the impression that this is the case. And you have the whole discussion later in comparative religious studies about perennialism and then the other thing is that, but basically it's this idea about mystical experiences. There's something specific about it, but with Schleiermacher, you don't necessarily need to have like a religious feeling by itself. Religious feelings can be multifaceted. And in fact, if you think that it arises from our creaturely nature, it arises from our interactions with the world. So just some brief recent examples. So one example would be that you anthropomorphize the environment. And this is commonly seen as one of the beginnings of religion. So if you look at the earliest expressions, physical evidence that we have for religious beliefs, then it seems to be shamanistic, animistic. And Stuart Guthrie, an early cognitive science of religion author, an anthropologist, argues that this kind of anthropomorphism just arises from a kind of low-level perceptual propensity for us to see, like, if you have an ambiguous stimulus, you're going to think it's animate and even it's human, because humans are so important in our evolutionary environment. And then you have intuitive teleology, which is an intuitive sense of purpose. And there was a whole discussion about whether we just attribute teleology to just those things that are clearly teleological. Like, for example, this spoon clearly has a purpose of, being made for a purpose. This is what Kyle calls selective teleology, but Deb Keleman has a huge research program showing that actually we attribute purpose far more widely than seems warranted. This persists in adults. It's stronger in people without any formal education, but even in PhD holders with STEM degrees, if you put them under pressure and you sort of give them teleological and non-teleological explanations, like the sun burns to keep life on Earth, or the sun burns because it's a big hydrogen bomb, then people will veer towards the teleological explanations. And the link with religion is very clear. So there's lots of research showing that religious participants are more willing to attribute teleology and to say it's made for a reason. But again, it's a more general propensity, and it expresses itself in religion, but it is actually a more general thing that we have in everyday life. Social surveillance is another example. So it's generally, so there's a lot of research showing that the feeling of social surveillance, and particularly supernatural social surveillance, increases cooperation and decreases cheating. This is commonly seen as one of the things that is connected to religions with powerful gods, or so-called the big gods. There's a whole discussion about what came first. So Aranor and Zion argued first came the big gods, and then people could cooperate in bigger groups. And Harvey Whitehouse and colleagues, I think also still at Oxford, they think, no, first you have large groups, and that makes the social surveillance gods more possible. But again, it's this kind of feeling that expresses itself in a wide range of contexts, like you have social surveillance, obviously also in non-religious contexts, that then gets expressed in religion. So note that these feelings do not pacify Christianity, but piety more generally. And Schleiermacher does not make the claim that Christianity is somehow implanted to us. Rather, he has this sort of idea of piety as a more general religious feeling. And in fact, he allows for cultural influences, and he sees theology as fundamentally a comparative project. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why he is called one of the earliest modern theologians. And I think it is advantageous to go back to Schleiermacher. And I know lots of people have done all sorts of things, like taking cognitive science of religion and tacking it onto Calvin, Plantinga, like Al-Ghazali and so on. But I think one of the advantages of looking at a theologian like Schleiermacher is that he has this really evolutionary, even though he wrote before Darwin, evolutionary perspective that is very naturalistic. And the advantage is that we can situate Christian faith as a result of complex cultural processes interacting with a very fundamental biological creaturely nature. So religion is a feeling, a kind of a feeling in the sense of consciousness, a kind of consciousness that arises of our creaturely nature, that arises out of the fact that we are agents, knowers, and feelers. And these are all important, but for Schleiermacher, the feeling, the subjectivity of us as organisms takes priority. So as we've seen, we've looked at contemporary philosophy of biology, and we've seen that it sheds light on what biological organisms are. And we've seen, so in contemporary philosophy of biology of people of like Godfrey Smith, Samir Kasha, and Richard Lewontin, that biological organisms are agents, they do things, they are subjects, feel things, and they represent things, they know things. And these three are foundational for organisms, and religion lies in the feeling, in the being a subject, into having a point of view. And that is the origin of the Christian faith. And so any discussions about, continued justification and so on should at the very least, in his view, take into consideration that that is the basis of religion. Thank you.